Hey, Mission Hills, welcome back to Continuing the Conversation, a podcast that follows up on our weekend message. I am JG. I'm filling in for Colin, and I'm here as always with Craig. And we're going to take a deeper look at what you unpacked for us in John 20 this past weekend. But first, Craig, you have no idea the storm you have started and how many conversations I have had about In-N-Out in this last week. And so I think the first thing is, what is your In-N-Out order? And how many times do you think we will do staff lunches at In-N-Out around the corner?
Oh, we've already done staff lunches, right? Like when they first showed up in Colorado, I remember the culture team was doing In-N-Out for some of our staff huddle lunches. My order's not super exciting. I get I don't even order enough to know exactly what the name is. What is it? The double? Is that what they call it?
Yes, that's exactly what they call it.
Okay, I nailed it. Cool.
Yeah.
I usually get the double cheeseburger. I have this kind of weird. This is more than most people need to know about me, but I love food, and I love lots of different kinds of food. I'm really perfectly content with all kinds of weird tastes and those kinds of things. There's something in me. I don't know what it is, but textures of food sometimes bother me. Mm-hmm. And so I don't love a lot of vegetables on my burger. So I tend to go kind of like, just give me cheese and meat. And the sauce. I like the In-N-Out sauce, but like I don't like pickles, and it's not really the taste. Mm-hmm. I don't like when I'm biting into a burger and I suddenly encounter a pickle. It's
surprise.
Same thing with Chick-fil-A, the other Christian food. You know,
mm-hmm.
It's a texture thing.
Yeah.
So I tend to go can I just get meat and cheese, a double meat and cheese.
It's great,
and a Coke.
It's simple.
That's classic.
That is classic. Get the veggies out of here. That's a good rule for all of life, I believe. Okay, but here post Easter, we are immediately jumping into a series that instead of moving on to a completely different topic, what I think is really interesting, what I've immediately noticed, is that this series, which we've titled Fear of Faith or Getting Beyond the Fear of Faith, instead of moving past Easter, you actually just went back and looked deeper at the Easter story. I would love to hear some background on that. Like, what is the thought process beside saying, hey, here's the forest of the Easter story. Now let's look deeper at the trees in John 20. Yeah, what's kind of the thought process? What are we hoping to look at and go into over the next couple of weeks?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I love what we did this year for Easter. And by the way, just for behind the scenes kind of thing, I usually kind of plan out a year worth of messages. I spend a lot of time in prayer and thinking about stuff and looking at some other that churches have done that I thought, I think that might be helpful for us, those kinds of things. And I sort of settle it all out. But I always leave Easter and Christmas a little bit kind of blank on this calendar. Like, we know we're going to do Easter. We know we're going to do Christmas. It's going to usually be all of December. But I actually like to let the team decide together what the theme of that's going to be, because he's risen and he was born, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, he's born at Christmas. He's risen at Easter. Sometimes those can be hard weekends, and so it's actually really helpful as a communicator to have some tracks to run on for creativity, rather than do something that's fresh, but it's also entirely faithful, and like figure that out. When the team comes together and says, "Hey, we'd love to craft a service that does this," I love that, because I'm able to go, oh, okay. Then from a preaching perspective, I need to get us from here to here, and it's just sometimes it's an easier process. So when the team decided they were going to do, or that we decided together that we were going to do the whole story, like from the crucifixion to the resurrection, death to life, then I was able to write a message that kind of moved the service along between those two things. But then there's some stuff that, as I was just reading and preparing for Easter, like over a year ago, as I was thinking about this, I was reading specifically what we talked about this week, that the other disciple, right, the one who Jesus loved, whoever that is, John, or as I talked about Lazarus, outran Peter to the tomb, but then he stopped. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I've heard people make the jokes about outrunning Peter. Like there's a lot of pastor jokes around that. But I've never heard anybody really make a big deal out of the fact that he stopped. And yet the point of saying he got there first seems to be that it sets up the contrast for the fact that he didn't go the farthest. Got there first, but he didn't go as far as he needed to. And that struck me about a year ago. And so I really felt like the Lord was saying, let's spend a little bit of time settling into that event, and then some of the stuff that happens after that, because I think there's some themes in John 20 about fear that are pretty consistent. I mean, obviously we have the doubting Thomas piece, but really I think that's a fear issue. Like, he's afraid to believe. Everybody's saying this has happened, and he probably wants to, but he is afraid to put his faith in that until it's absolutely certain beyond any shadow of a doubt. And so, yeah, I just thought, I think that's a common theme for all of us, that like we understand what faith is, but there's a fear of having faith and a fear of what faith calls us to. And so I was learning a bunch from chapter 20 about like, how do I deal with it? So I thought this would make a good series.
Absolutely, because there's so much guilt and what you talked about in shame, in fear, especially for those of us who have been walking with Jesus for a long time.
Absolutely.
Of saying like, man, I should be past this. I should be as bold as those others I see. Like you brought that up, this idea of how there's maybe some people who have come to faith more recently put us to shame a little bit, like Peter running into the tomb while the others stood outside. But there's so much to say to every believer and every person who is seeking at every stage of a fear here. So my question, I think, is where do you see how we can kind of differentiate between, hey, that's a good, healthy fear of this is a good system that God has given me so I can assess risk and then move forward and maybe stay away from dangerous places, versus, hey, this is a fear that is fueled by doubt and shame and actually seeks to separate me from God's plan for my life. I know it's hard to know which one is which, but
a really good question.
I wonder if you've wrestled with it already.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Let me think out loud with you a little bit.
Yeah,
So this may not be any good at all. We don't always prep these questions. In fact, we never prep the questions.
That's right.
So like, I don't necessarily have anything pre-planned. But when you were asking that question, I thought of a couple things. Number one, I thought of my daughter Rochelle. She was maybe 5 or 6 years old, and Cled and I went to Breckenridge, and we took the lift up to do the Alpine slide, right? Yeah. And Rochelle's 5 or 6 is probably, I think she'd been on a lift before that, but she wasn't bundled up in snow gear and everything, and so she kept leaning over, like trying to get to the front to look down. And I was like, you got, and I kept pulling her back, and she kept doing it, and I finally said to her, "Man, you just don't have any fear, do you?" And she goes, "No, I need to get me some of that, don't I?" And I was like, as a dad, I'm like, okay, wait a minute. This is a weird moment because, yeah, there is some fear that's healthy. And the fact that you don't have enough fear to, like, keep you from dangling over something in an unhealthy and potentially dangerous way, you probably do need a little fear, because there is a good thing that fear does, and that is it protects us from unnecessary risk, unnecessary danger. But then what happens, like everything else with sin, is what was good turns into something that's bad, right? And so the fear that keeps us from what is in fact not good or not of God or in fact dangerous becomes something that keeps us from what is good and is of God, and isn't that it's dangerous, it's just unknown, and sometimes the best things are happening in those unknown places. So I wonder if what makes it possible to distinguish between the two is the question of whether or not there's any thrill in it, any excitement in it. Like as I think about like her leaning over, well, there wasn't any real value in what she was doing. She was just, I'm kind of interested in seeing that, right? Whereas when you're standing on top of the hill, like a really steep hill with skis on, you're like, this is a steep hill. This is a little scary. But the thought of like navigating this successfully and the speed and the exhilaration, there's a thrill. Like I'm interested in this. But fear, okay, so then it becomes the balance between, like, why am I excited about this, right? I remember when Cled and I moved to Colorado, there was a lot of fear in that. I still remember, it's been almost 30 years, and I remember going, we don't know anybody, and I don't know how I'm going to do in seminary, and like, are we going to make friends, and is this church thing that they've tried to hire me for, is that going to work out? And Cled doesn't have a job yet, and like, there's fear, like maybe this is dumb. But then there was this sense that, going to seminary is kind of exciting, and how that sets us up for the next thing that God's going to call us to, our next assignment, and discovering a new place. And we were excited about Colorado itself. We loved to hike and ski and those kinds of things. And so there was this, I really want to get to that, and fear says, I'm going to keep you from that. And I wonder if that's part of it. Yeah. Like if it's like there's no excitement about what you could get to. Well, maybe that's fear trying to tell you, well, then don't go there. Yeah. Right? Yeah. But I do think that God often leads us with some little picture of what's in front, like the promised land, right? Mm-hmm. That's going to be really good, guys. Yes. It's a land flowing with milk and honey. You're not going to be enslaved anymore. Oh, I'm really excited about that. But the people there are really big. But I'm really excited. But the people there are really, maybe there's some of that. If there's no tugging, no push and pull in that, then maybe fear is doing a good thing. Right. But if there is a pull to the thing, then maybe fear is doing a bad thing because it's trying to prevent you from what God's pulling you to. I don't know.
Absolutely, especially when you explained so clearly this past weekend that we actually do have an enemy who would like to speak the voice of fear into our lives and say, hey, don't go there when God is something incredible in front of you. So yeah, maybe it is that. It's that sense of adventure of like God's calling you to an unknown thing more than God's calling you to a dangerous thing where he may or may not protect you. But it's more of, hey, what's the unknown thing? Yeah. Honestly, as I re-listened to this past weekend to prepare for today, I thought about how much of this is an incredible sort of message that's not trying to be, but on a lot of things with mental health in terms of shame and anxiety, because anxiety is really healthy. It'll keep you from getting eaten by a wild animal, but what happens is when it becomes problematic when it is associated with situations where there is actually no threat. We are fearful of things that aren't actually in front of us. They aren't actually dangerous. And it's sort of this souring of fear that you kind of talk about.
Well, boy, and wait till this next week.
Yeah.
Because what's
preview.
little
Give a tease.
Little tease here this next week. We're going to look at Mary's actual encounter with Jesus. Mm-hmm. What's interesting, and I'd never really noticed this before, but as I was preparing this message a few weeks ago, and this week as I brought it back out, and I'm working on it, and I'm talking to people about it, there's 4 uses of the Greek word for weeping, but it's not like I'm crying, or like, like, oh, I stubbed my toe and I'm crying. It's the deep anguish, sobbing, this overwhelming emotion. Right. And it comes up 4 times. It comes up 2 times that she's doing it. And then 2 times the angels and Jesus go, woman, why are you doing this? And it's interesting that in all of that, she cannot recognize some things that are happening. Yeah. And I'm going to give way too much away, but it'd be interesting to see how this plays out. She can't recognize what's going on in the tomb because the angels, and John says they were seated, one at the head and one at the foot, which I think is probably a reference to the Ark of the Covenant.
Yeah, sounds like
the cherubim that enclosed the mercy seat from which the atonement was supposed to go out. Whew. Wow, but Jesus is no longer there because the atonement's done. Like it's all paid. She couldn't recognize that because she was weeping. She was sobbing. And then she meets Jesus. Yeah. And she thinks he's the gardener because she's weeping, which is why, again, the question, why are you weeping? And I think what happens here is there's this sense in which our pain, if we're not really careful about it, it can blind us to the presence of God. And the tension that we have to deal with is, like when I was growing up, and I'll talk about this a little bit more this weekend, but when I was growing up, it was sort of deny you have emotions. Yeah. Right. Men don't cry, and like just suck it up and go
pick yourself up.
Just do it. You don't like your job.
Get it together.
Who likes their job? Yeah. You're not supposed to like your job. You're supposed to do your job. And now I think we've swung the pendulum probably too far the other direction.
Sure.
And we've moved from deny it to let it define you. Well, that's not healthy either. There's a middle ground that we need to find where we deal with it, but we don't let it define us because it can blind us. And so we'll actually talk about that a little bit more this week because I think that's part of what's going on. I can't explain otherwise why there's this pretty strong emphasis on the weeping because I think the depth of her anguish is partly why she's unable to recognize what's in front of us. And I wonder how often that happens.
Right.
Like something gets taken away from us and we're grieving that so much that we're utterly unable to see God actually just put something else in front of us. Yeah. And all we're doing is looking for that thing. Where did it go? And I can't believe it's gone. And God's like, yeah, but here. And we're like, yeah. Where'd that thing go? What's wrong with you, God? So we'll talk a little bit more about mental health this week, actually.
That's going to be great. I actually can't wait, especially because
I probably just gave it all away, honestly. I don't think I have any more profound than that. But.
You got at least 3 times as long to unpack it this weekend. So I'm excited to see what comes up. But also, too, here's what I'm excited for, Craig. Anytime Jesus interacts with a person in Scripture, we get this like crazy 3D view of how different he is than what we expect, right? Because we've experienced a lot of people talking to us about our fear and a lot of people talking to us about our emotions that sound like that idea of like, hey, get it together. Who likes their job? Just do your job. Or, hey, you're sad, but look, here's a puppy. Like when we were kids of like, don't be sad. But you're going to see something.
Or the flip side, you're not sad. You have anxiety.
Oh yeah.
Or you have trauma, and it's defining you, right?
Absolutely.
So you get those very different voices.
Yeah, which are very similar to shame that you talked about. This idea of like not just hey that was bad, but I am bad. Yep. That is deep in me now. Yep. What happened to me has made me bad.
Yeah, I
And
did
somebody
bad
is going to
versus
find
I
out.
am. Yeah.
It's going to be, yeah, man. Well, we could continue to open that can of worms, but we'll leave something for Colin
Please
next
do.
week. We'll be
Yeah,
courteous
and leave me
to
something to
him.
preach this weekend. So.
Yeah, sure. That's great. I think so. As I was prepping for today, I was sitting at Lost Coffee, really close to our Littleton campus, and I met somebody who was like, "Hey, what are you prepping for?" And he goes here. His name's Don, and I asked him like, "Hey, what do you want to talk about?" And one of the things he brought up was this Beyond campaign that we just went through. And he made a note of like, honestly, it was really courageous as a church and for your leadership to step into it. So if you could for a second, this whole like stepping out in faith instead of being stopped by fear, I know that this process of doing the Beyond campaign was also kind of a story that teaches that also. So could you pull back the curtain a little bit? And for us, what was that journey like for you as you said, man, Lord, I feel like you're asking us to do that, but it is scary. Like, what did the resistance feel like to you? Because we're about to try to apply this in our lives this week. And I know you've been applying it in your life over the past couple months. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, this will be celebration weekend. We'll talk a little bit about like what God has done, and I'm super excited about it. I'm not going to give anything away, but I think what was scary about the Beyond thing for me, well, there's a lot of things that were scary about it. First off, we talked about money for 6 weeks.
Yeah.
And
Everybody's favorite.
And I used to not talk about money at all, and then I've shared some of this in the series. I just got convicted that I was not shepherding people. I wasn't pastoring them. Because the Bible talks about money almost more than anything else. It's basically glory of God, danger of money. Like those are your two big topics, honestly. And the fact that I wasn't dealing with it on a regular basis meant that I really wasn't taking my call to disciple people seriously in that area. Fear was keeping me away from it. But I felt it again when I came back in, because usually when I teach on it, it's like, we'll do a 3-week series here. I think usually annually we'll do something like that. And a lot of people don't know that's what's happening, because I'll disguise a giving series essentially as a step of faith series or something like that. And it's in there, but it's not quite as overt. There's a little bit of overt, but being overt didn't bother me. 6 weeks made me a little fearful, because I was afraid people are going to be like, I'm just so sick of it. And I'm sure that happened. I was really surprised by the number of people who had his response, Don's response, and told me stories about how they had realized in this series they were not trusting God. And it might have been financial, but it wasn't always financial. Sometimes it was just like this whole series, like they really received it as I intended it, this is mostly a faith journey, right? It's got some financial implications, but it's a faith initiative. And I heard a lot of stories from people who were basically going, yeah, I've realized that's not what I've been doing. I have not been trusting God. Whether it was financial or otherwise. I was surprised by how many stories had nothing to do with finances. And that was really encouraging. But it's interesting, that's the thing about fear. Fear tells you to stop. We talked about that this past week, instead of step. And only by stepping into it and going through it for 6 weeks did I get to see some of what God was doing in some people's lives. And even some profound stories of life change coming to faith. And I'm like, I did not expect people to say yes to Jesus during a faith series, but it happened. It actually happened many times. So by stepping forward in spite of that faith, what are people going to think about me? So that was one fear I dealt with. I think another fear, honestly, I dealt with was just the whole, like, we set a big goal. Like, what happens if we don't get there, right? What happens if we don't? Then we have to say we failed. And God was speaking to me even early on, and I felt like he was saying, like, I'm not going to tell you what you need. We set a number based on like what we knew needed to happen and our best estimates of what it was going to take to get us there. And I sense God saying, like, I'm not going to tell you exactly how much you need. You need to do this series. And yes, you have these needs, these obstacles to overcome, these opportunities to seize. I just need you to trust me that we're going to get them done, right? And this is your step of faithfulness, do this series. And so but I remember feeling the fear, like, well, what happens if we set this number, we don't get it? Does that make us failures? And I realized as we were in the process of doing that, of stepping instead of stopping and doing what God was calling us to, that, like, I genuinely do believe God he's gonna show up and he's gonna take care of what needs to be done. And if the money didn't come in, then okay, then we don't need to do this. Or if the money didn't come in at quite the level we were thinking, that he had some other way to do something that he'd laid on our hearts needed to be done. And so, but that was a scary thing, right? Like, what if I didn't hear God right on this? And God was like, I didn't give you a number. I just told you some things you needed to do and told you to figure it out. Like, we came up with an estimate, and God's like, yeah, those are good things.
Absolutely.
Like, we're going to get them done. but you're gonna have to trust me to see how we do it.
Yeah, and it certainly has. It's one of those things with following God and saying yes in faith. Really don't grow out of this like growth opportunity for trusting, and you also
Always
don't
room.
grow out of this sense of dependence. Because I could, even if like that time, that fear of what happens if we don't reach it, like I see the opportunity for the voice of shame and to come in and be like, wow, look at what are people going to think of us if we don't, there's always like risks, but then there's always traps, but there's always opportunity
Yep.
ahead of us too.
Yep.
And you mentioned God's glory as part of all of it, and I wonder how much of it is that where our walk with Jesus is always a risk-taking faith. There is no way to walk with Jesus that is not a risk-taking faith.
That's right.
And I wonder how much of it is because you talked about God's glory and how much he talks about money, and also 365 times, do not fear, how intimately tied those things are together. Like we're called to take risks constantly in faith, but in a way that's tied to God always getting the glory in our story, like for our good and for his glory.
Well, I don't know if you know this. You may, but do you know the Hebrew word for glory?
No.
It's kabod.
Yes.
Okay. And
Which kind of means like weight,
yes,
right?
exactly. And that's which is so interesting because the Greek word for glory is it's a doxa word, and it kind of means light. And so we tend to think, the glory of God is this bright, shiny light. But I love that in the Hebrew Bible, which is most of the Bible, right? The glory of God is the weight of God. It's not the bright, shiny, it's not the wah. It's this heavy weight. And I think what's powerful about that is the thing that has the most weight is the thing that you orbit around.
Absolutely.
Right? In the
Gravity.
solar system, what has the most weight? It's the sun, right? The sun cannot orbit the Earth. And in fact, if it did, we would have all kinds of problems, right? The moon has to orbit the Earth, not the other way around, because the Earth has more weight than the moon. And so there's this sense of this is just the way it's going to work. If you don't pay attention to what has the most weight, like things are going to, if the Earth's like, yeah, I know the sun has the most weight, but I'm not going to orbit around. I'm going to head straight this direction.
Yeah.
Almost immediately what happens? Well, that's the end of all life on Earth, right? So the weight of God, the glory of God, means that God should be in the center and everything orbits around him. And it's not because God's like, I need your attention. Like I'm so like self-centered that I have to have your worship. He's like, no, I love you.
Yeah.
I have more weight than you do. I have more weight than this thing in your life. And if you give the weight to that and you take up orbit around that, you're going to be like the Earth that has said, I'm not going to orbit the sun, I'm going off over here, but you've gone off into darkness. You've gone off into cold. You've gone off into the end of where real life happens, right? And so I think what happens is that money is very often the thing that tries to get the most weight in our lives.
Does.
And that's why God talks about it so much.
Yeah.
He's like, no, you got to give me the weight. You got to give me the glory, but it's ultimately for your good.
Yes.
Right? And I like growing up, I think I heard a lot about the glory of God, and I never understood it as having anything to do with my good.
Yeah.
At the best, what I would hear was, you got to give God glory because that's what you were made for. You were made to worship.
Yeah.
And I accepted that for a long time. And in fact, we have songs. Like as a worship leader, I sang songs.
Yeah.
You and I were made to worship, right? Love that Tomlin song. Great song. But it's interesting. You go back to Genesis 1, 2, and then ultimately 3, of course.
Yeah.
There's not any conversation about God making us to worship him.
Right.
We're made to represent him, but if by representing him, we're actually giving him the weight, right?
Yeah.
We're going, like I'm accomplishing your purposes, your will. That's giving God the weight. It's giving God the glory. And in a sense, that is worship.
Yeah.
But it's not the worship as we think about it. And I always heard growing up that we were made to worship, and what that essentially meant was God needed us to worship him, which isn't true.
No, not at all.
He existed for all
Absolutely.
eternity without our worship. He didn't make us so that he would have people to worship him and to glorify him, but he made us out of an overflow of, I believe, the relationship within the members of the Trinity. He made us to be in a loving relationship with him, which is to say he made us ultimately for our good.
Yeah.
And it is our good to give him the glory, because we're in orbit around the only thing that's life-giving rather than something that's life-taking.
Absolutely.
And that's an interesting but fundamentally different shift in the way we think about glory and worship and what God was trying to do and all those things, and why he talks about these other things so much. It's not that he's like, I'm jealous, you're taking my child away from me, and you're taking away my worship. No. It's like, no, you're like, you stopped orbiting what's life-giving, and you took off into darkness and to death. Because you're putting weight on something that it doesn't have it.
And it makes sense to bring it back to these places of stepping into dark places where we cannot see. We talked about these 3 levels of seeing and these 3 characters that we saw in this passage. It makes sense that we are so afraid of darkness because we are used to, without God, darkness meaning death and chaos and striving and just this ultimate sense of, man, I've lost it and I don't know what's going to happen. But with God's glory at the center and his heart for us, that we are made to flourish and that his glory means our good, like we have such a different reaction if we step out in faith here. I'm so excited for you to continue to unpack it. It's going to be great. How many weeks are we in it?
4 weeks.
Great.
Yep.
A good old 4 weeks.
Pretty nicely into 4 messages.
Perfect. Cannot wait. Well, guys, thank you so much for joining us today on continuing the conversation with Craig, and I'm JG. We cannot wait for you to join us again this weekend as we continue our series, The Fear of Faith. Thanks.
Getting beyond
the fear of faith.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
God bless. Have a great week.
Thank you.
This podcast is hosted by Colin McFarland along with Craig Smith. We are mixed, edited, and produced by Zach Anderson. Our creative director is Colin McFarland. Maddie Brower is our SEO and copy specialist. The Continuing the Conversation feed is part of the Mission Hills Podcast Network in Littleton, Colorado, and available for download wherever you get your audio and video podcasts. Thanks for listening.